Money never sleeps, pal.
Hey there, this is Pete Townsend from Norio Ventures, and welcome to Money Never Sleeps, a podcast that looks inside the head of entrepreneurs and at the crossover of startups, enterprise, finance, technology, and life as we know it. This episode of Money Never Sleeps is kindly sponsored by Ireland's fintech and financial services recruitment specialists, Top Tier Recruitment. If you or a colleague need help attracting and retaining great talent for your fintech or financial services company, it's highly advisable that you build a relationship with the team at Top Tier Recruitment. You can find them at toptierrecruitment.com and tell them we sent you. This week, we talked to Peter Geoghegan, an Irish journalist and author who recently published his new book, Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics. We're stepping into the life as we know it part of the podcast with this timely interview of Peter, with Democracy for Sale flying off the shelves and zapping into your Kindles this month. So let's all just follow the money in the minds with Peter Geoghegan on this week's episode of Money Never Sleeps.
Money never sleeps, pal.
Here we go again. Welcome to Money Never Sleeps. We're recording today from the home studio, and we're on with Peter Geoghegan, journalist, author, and broadcaster, with his latest book being Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics. It's been quoted as essential reading for anyone who wants to make sense out of politics, says Carol Cadwalader, the investigative journalist who exposed the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal. It's also described as urgent as it is illuminating, says Fintan O'Toole, columnist, literary editor, and drama critic for the Irish Times. So, with that crescendo and somewhat long-winded intro, Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me on, guys.
Awesome. Glad to have you here. So, Owen pointed out your book to me a couple of weeks ago, and I'm still in the middle of it, right? But each page fills me with more and more trepidation than the last. And it's like walking down a dark set of stairs into a slimy, smelly basement that I'm just not sure I want to keep going down into, but I will, just because I need to see what's down at the bottom of the stairs. There's lots to this, and I think we'll get into the book Democracy for Sale, right? But just to kind of kick things off, do you want to tell us your backstory and how you got to this point?
Yeah, well, there's almost like two twin tracks that kind of led me to. I'm quite surprised that I've spent the last kind of 3 years, which I have done, kind of researching and writing all about the kind of issues of money, power, influence, and unaccountable money, power, and influence in British politics, but at times in other kind of global settings too. I kind of wouldn't have expected this. My last book was in 2014, and it was called The People's Referendum, and it was all about the Scottish independence referendum, which I covered extensively. I'm speaking to here from Glasgow. On my career up to that point, up to 2014, was as a journalist, I'd worked for lots of newspapers, both in mainly in Scotland. I'd been a kind of jobbing journalist for quite a long time. I worked on the independence referendum extensively. I was freelance for that, and I wrote for basically every newspaper under the sun, from the New York Times to the Irish Times and everyone in between. And so I spent a long time working as a kind of journalist, kind of up to 2014. And then around kind of after the independence referendum here in Scotland, and after I used to write a lot of news features, I used to write a lot about politics. I was always interested in politics. But around that time, I started becoming more interested in investigations and investigative journalism, because, I'm quite interested in how media is changing and how media is changing. I'm always very aware of and keep a close eye on. And we're seeing as we speak this week, there's more job cuts coming into Fleet Street in London. But over the last 15, 20 years, there's been a huge kind of retrenchment and truncation in the media landscape. And as a journalist, I always enjoyed writing features. I wrote quite like a lot of almost like creative nonfiction. But I became aware that there will always be a value in new information. There will always be a value. And I kind of felt like investigations was a place I wanted to position myself, partly because I'm really interested in investigative journalism, but also I felt like it was an area where there wasn't as much work going on as there used to be. So 2015, I got on to Dispatch's training scheme for Channel 4, for television. So I worked for Channel 4, and they trained you up, and it's basically it's a kind of a first job in television investigative journalism. So that was a very kind of intensive but a great experience. And they choose 5 people out of 1,000, and they train you up, and they kind of set you up with skills that kind of complement the skills that you have going in as a kind of someone who knows what a story looks like knows how to put narratives together, knows how to write, but it's kind of putting that together with real investigative skills and with television skills. And at the same time, I actually set up a startup in Scotland called The Ferret, which is still going actually 5 years later, is a cooperative investigative journalism project, which is based on reader subscriptions and has now has 2.5 members of staff and 1,500 paying subscribers, and delivers kind of quality investigative journalism in Scotland, because there's been a similar problem in Scotland with the kind of truncation of the media. And the reason I'm saying all this is because this is my backstory into investigations. And this book really comes out of my kind of almost personal journey into starting to do a lot more investigative journalism. So this book is a product of really 3 years of investigative journalism. But if I was to say what was the moment where this book started, like what was the point? And that point was, and I still remember very well, it was the 21st of June, 2016, 2 days before the Brexit referendum. I was in Sunderland in the northeast of England. I was actually working for the Irish Times. I was up writing a feature just before the Brexit vote. And I was doing that thing that journalists do at that moment before a big political event. You go up to a town you've not been to, everyone knows the spiel. You go and you talk to people, you try and get a temperature. You try as best you can, really, to try and get under the skin of it. It's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to do well, to try and represent what's going on. And I was just actually on my way out of Sunderland, and I was in a train station, and I noticed there was a copy of the Metro, the free newspaper, and it had a big advert in the front of it that said, "Take Back Control," which was the slogan of Vote Leave, the official pro-Brexit campaign. And I just kind of picked it up, as you do. I was waiting for the train to pull in, and I noticed on the back it had the logo of the Democratic Unionist Party. And I used to work in Belfast, so I knew the DUP well, and it had a little imprint that said "Paid for on behalf of the Democratic Unionist Party." And I thought, this is quite an odd thing. Like, why is a Democratic Unionist Party spending money hundreds of miles away from the glens of Antrim on expensive newspaper ads in Sunderland? So that kind of got my mind ticking over. But I did what journalists do now. As a news reporter, I took a picture of it, I sent a tweet, I got on the train, put the newspaper in my bag and started writing my copy for the next day's edition. And it kind of stuck in my mind in the coming weeks and months, this advert I'd seen, partly because I knew something else about Northern Ireland and Northern Irish politics, which is that under Northern Irish law, electoral donations to politics were kept secret at that stage. So because of the troubles, because of the violence, it had been decided that political donations would not be published and would not be recorded. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder, did somebody know this? Is that why the DUP done this? And I kind of boxed it away as one of those strange things. And in early January 2017, Adam Ramsey, who's a journalist at Open Democracy, got in touch with me. He sent me a message. I kind of vaguely knew each other. He lives in Edinburgh, I was in Glasgow. And Adam said, "I hear you're interested in the DUP's Brexit spending." I said, "Yeah, I am. Yeah, why did you ask?" I told him my story. And Adam had been in Edinburgh in the run-up to the Brexit vote. And he noticed all these placards everywhere. Same thing, Vote Leave, big red placard. And again, it said, "Paid for by the Democratic Unionist Party." So the two of us were sitting there going, this is quite interesting. So we decided to collaborate on the first story together, which turned into an epic in many respects. And it was all about the DUP's Brexit money. And we kind of were able to work out together that the DUP had spent hundreds of thousands of pounds. It actually turned out to be £435,000, all in the last days of the Brexit referendum. Almost all of it outside Northern Ireland, just £10,000 spent in Northern Ireland. And it had all been kind of rooted through a thing called the Constitutional Research Council, which sounds very grand, sounds like a great, kind of august institution doing great research, but actually is a kind of legal fiction. It's something in British election law called an unincorporated association, which means it doesn't file accounts, doesn't have an address, doesn't have members, in many, for all intents and purposes, doesn't have any legal standing. And this money had come to this organisation and gone into DUP's Brexit spending. And this kind of spurred me. I kind of was like, wow, if it's possible to do this, what else is going on in politics? What else is going on with money and influence? So it was one story that kind of broke open a whole, I wouldn't say broke up a hornet's nest. It's too much of a mixed metaphor, but really kind of led me into, let me describe it. A rabbit hole is an apt description of it, because
that's what I was thinking of.
I found myself in this world and asking questions that I'd not asked before about how the world works and how politics works.
crazy. And I can see the movie in your future, Peter, where you taking a picture of the back of the metro, seeing this ad, and then, with multi-frame shot of all these different moving trains, whatever. I think it's going to happen. Fascinating that is how this all started. You mentioned
it's funny actually, because speaking of movies, I watched it for the first time. I watched the Brexit on Civil War movie that she'd referred to in the book. I know it's been on Netflix for ages. I just hadn't watched it, but I watched it the other night, knowing that we were going to be talking to you this week because I'd wanted to watch it anyway. So, and I watching it, obviously having just read the book and everything, being like, "Wow, this is like, it's just crazy to see it all." But I also found, like, Peter's talking about the trepidation almost turning every page on it. It's because it's so near to, like, you're writing about the most recent history, but also obviously still playing out in time now. It's just, you're looking at the stuff and looking at some of the stuff that the likes of Dominic Cummings would have been involved in, but yet there he is. You see reference to him every day. Like, it's bizarre how close to, like, real time almost that it is. And still going on. So, it's just fascinating. And I fully expect there'll be a movie in a couple of years' time about it.
Yeah. I just got through the part where you wrote something to the effect of fake news has become the standard populist response to an inconvenient revelation, right? I thought that was brilliant. It makes me think, if we really come to this, right? And what politicians used to quake in their boots about and have a whole SWAT team of activity and press managers working on to contain the impact is now just dismissed as fake news, and everyone moves on.
Yeah, I think.
Right.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that's the huge thing that we've seen. I think it's one of the huge shifts as a journalist in trying to cover things like this. It's actually one of the challenges, I think, in doing this sort of reporting now. Whereas in the past, there's a section of the book where I talk about this obscure, quite an obscure think tank in some respects, called Atlantic Bridge, which was set up by a man called Liam Fox, who had been the defence secretary under David Cameron, a Conservative leader, and actually later became a Brexit minister. And this think tank was basically funded by dark money from anonymous funders from the United States. By the time Liam Fox became the Minister for Defence, his man called Adam Verity was actually going to meetings with him, with foreign leaders, clandestinely, not being recorded. It turned into a huge political scandal. And that scandal really erupted from one very small thing. It was a charity commission had decided to look into this think tank and said it had problems with it. They tried to close the think tank down, and then all the press got wind of it, and it became this running story. And it ended up with Liam Fox getting the bullet. And the reason I talk about that in length in the book is twofold. One is because it's very interesting, I think, about the links between the kind of libertarian right in America and the Brexit, like the kind of pro-Brexit conservative lobby in Britain, and it's a theme of the book. But also, it's actually to show that how the kind of stories that would have been treated, as you say, would have had a phalanx of press officers on top of it, kind of figuring out. Liam Fox would have had the ultimate many moments where, like, will I go? Can I stay? Oh, and eventually there comes one more revelation, too many, and you have to go. That's not the case now. The Dominic Cummings saga of lockdown-breaking trip to Durham showed that. It came to a point where it was a kind of Donald Trump-esque. If Dominic Cummings had been found to have, shot a man in Darlington on his way home, it probably would cost his job.
No, it's, and as you can hear in my voice, Peter, still American after all these years, living in Ireland now for 15 years and gone from the US for 20. I'm still looking at what Donald Trump is doing every day. I actually look at the BBC News so that I get somewhat of an objective view. And I kind of feel like again, like I said, only a quarter of the way through the book, it feels like he's set an example for the other heads of state that makes him say, well, if you can get away with it, so can I. And Dominic Cummings kind of following that same path, Boris Johnson following the same path, and that, do you think there's going to be a path ahead of us? I'm kind of getting, what's the word, philosophical here almost, but, is there a path ahead of us that I don't think we'll ever be going back, but at least reintroduce some decorum into democracy? I mean, do you see that ahead of us?
I think it's an interesting moment. I've been reading Anne Applebaum's new book, and I was actually kind of thinking about this too, about, what's going to happen after this? The pandemic, I think it's an interesting moment to talk and think about this. We can see that the countries led by populist authoritarians have fared badly in the pandemic. From the United States to Russia to Brazil, and I think you can include Britain in that too. The countries that have decided to say to think that like the famous neocon Karl Rove phrase that we make reality, which in some ways is kind of underneath this kind of populist facade, is this idea that just by saying something we can make it true. Like, we describe our app as world beating. It then becomes world beating, even though we end up junking it, after about 2 weeks because it doesn't work. In the very act of saying it, you call it into being. And I wonder if we're reaching, and I hope in my optimistic way, I sometimes think hopefully we're reaching some sort of limit on this. And I do think the November election in America is a very important one.
Critical.
Really,
it does seem like it's going to be a turning point. I take your point. Like I was speaking to Pete just before you joined us earlier, and to me, part of reading the book, it felt almost like a playbook of sorts. You were describing a playbook that if I really wanted to go about influencing a country's elections and power and the decision making, that this is how I'd go about doing it. And it was effectively in plain sight to a degree, and that. And I suppose one of the things I was wondering then is that, a lot of this has come out and there's been inquiries and there's been things, but do you think, do people not care, or maybe is that moment hopefully coming this year where people will stand up now and vote to show that they care? Because there's a lot of it, obviously, as you'd mentioned, that has come out and these stories have been told, but yet it feels like nothing has changed.
Yeah, it was interesting. One of my motivations for writing the book, actually, like a lot of the reporting in the book is my own. A lot of it is colleagues, both at Open Democracy and lots of other news organizations who I try and credit throughout the book. And I wanted to almost, even as a journalist at times, I struggled to follow all of these stories as they were happening. From Cambridge Analytica to Vote Leave, Aaron Banks. There was a lot of nest of stories going on, Brexit over the last few years. And what I was trying to do was put them all together in some sort of coherent narrative, with some sense that this is what was going on, and the kind of, at times, like speaking to interesting key players, whether it's Tory MPs, Labour MPs, or even someone like Steve Bannon, to get a sense of what it might have been like within it. And what I find, though, and I think the reason I'm saying that is I think it's been, for the public or for voters, at times it's been hard to not switch off. And I think that's actually dangerous, because then it erodes democracy further. You end up in that place where they're all the same. Politicians are all the same. And I interact with a lot of politicians. I don't think all politicians are the same. And I don't think every politician goes in. I think a lot of them get corrupted by the system. And I think they can be corrupted in ways that they don't even realize they're actually corrupting, if that makes sense. I think it's not always the transactional politics. And I write about it a little bit in the book, growing up in Ireland in the world of brown envelopes. It's a transactional way of thinking about politics, where you give someone money and they go and do something for you. And if they don't do it for you, you don't give them the money in the brown envelope again. And that was a real facet of of parish pump politics in Ireland. Whereas what I'm narrating, as you say, is actually far more, I think, in some respects, far more insidious. It's less about the transactional corrupting of an individual and more about a corrupting of a system. And I think, we can't underestimate the way the information revolution has changed our politics and our world in a fundamental way. And I'm really struck increasingly that, I talk about the Americanization of British politics in the book. But you can almost make the argument for the Americanization of the world's politics. And I think that's partly due to, I think the internet's a huge part of that. The internet is a Silicon Valley invention. It's in many respects the way we think about the internet in terms of its freedoms and its limitations and everything else is a very American view of the world. And I've been really struck how aspects, you see it in Ireland too, look at the way social media has changed Irish politics, and really, whether it's the Roderick O'Gorman thing that happened recently, there's a way in which I think politics in Ireland has been changed, politics in Britain has been changed in a kind of, almost like a kind of mirror image of an American vision of politics. And it's not necessarily that someone sat down and tried to do it, but the way social media and the way the internet has moderated, mediated our politics has made that almost inevitable. And I think we're seeing that across boundaries. So, I'm at some stages I'm kind of following actual transactions of money, whether it's, there's a chapter in the book looking at the Christian right in the States and how it's funneled money around the world and what that's done. But in some instances as well, it's as much about the ways of being on the internet and the ways of working, because actually when it comes to things like emotions and politics, I remember living in America during the 2004, the run-up to 2004 presidential election, when the Bush campaign put out really aggressive attack ads against John Kerry. If you remember the Swift boat ads, very famous.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of politics wasn't happening in other places. It didn't happen in Britain. It didn't happen in Ireland. But the internet means that actually that emotive politics, which gets people riled up, is now a globalized phenomenon, and it's done in ways I think it's so instantaneous and so hard to track. And it doesn't need to come from actual official political accounts. Indeed, it's much more successful if it doesn't.
And it's interesting because I mentioned at the start, like I have a kind of morbid fascination in this. I read a book a number of years back, The Victory Lab by Sasha Eisenberg, who I think writes for New York Times, and it was about the history of campaigns. And like myself and Pete would have a lot of kind of background on the data analytics side, working with startup companies and stuff. And I found it fascinating. And in some ways, to me, the turning point, like Obama and his campaign and the social media campaign that he ran was a turning point in election campaigning to a degree. But actually, he's nearly the last great president or presidential example, even as you said, like that Americanization of politics across a number of different countries. Like a lot of people would put him up there as the kind of gold standard, regardless of what country you're from. Whereas you don't see that, you don't find that type of politics or that type of politician anymore, where it's about the narrative and the message that they can portray through their speeches. It's all, he almost, it's as if a combination of how he ran his campaign showed what could be done, and then it turned kind of dark in that sense.
Yeah, I think there's almost a wariness, I think, about even like engaging with some of those, like the mechanics of political manipulation, whether you're progressive or conservative. And I think there's a squeamishness because people don't like to think that they're manipulatable. And even like when it comes to, say, writing a book like mine, often people will go, how can you prove that, like, whatever it is, the DUP spending had any effect on the Brexit vote? You can't, and I can't. And I can't predict, that's not possible. But I think that often misunderstands how exactly the kind of thing you're talking about, how the actual mechanics of messaging, the mechanics of engagement with voters, that actually Obama, and I do write about that too, how that was such a seminal campaign, but it provided tools that are actually could be used in lots and lots of other different ways. And I think that's what we're seeing, is how the actual tools of the internet, which we forget. Do you remember the Arab Spring was initially seen as this great Twitter revolution? I was lucky enough actually to report from Egypt. I remember standing in Tahrir Square just a couple of months after the revolution, when it was in that kind of febrile moment before the first big election. And at that stage, it was still the Twitter revolution. And it was how the internet had allowed individuals to connect with each other in an authoritarian society, to build alliances in ways that they couldn't build them before, across class lines, religious lines, political lines, gender lines, you name it. And we were talking about how this is going to be this incredible empowerment for citizens. And it has been shocking, I think, in many respects, to see how that has turned. But with hindsight, it's probably not that surprising, because if you look at how manipulatable we are as people, there's a reason why there's a multi-billion-dollar ad industry. Like, people can be manipulated, and I can be. We all can be. It's very hard not to be. And I think we all probably maybe lost sight of just how these tools actually could be used in lots of other ways, especially in if it was happening in situations where people were fearful, people were angry. These are the emotions. Hope is a harder emotion to stir, and to keep kind of inflated than fear and kind of like anger, and how that has driven politics. If you speak to people, as I was saying earlier, I'm interested in how the media works. If you look at like the kind of hyper-partisan websites, I interview people who run like kind of right-wing hyper-partisan websites and leftist ones too for the book. And like, they can see themselves what works. And they can see the headlines that works, and they can see how emotion works. And it's actually economics that will drive that then. Economics then will kick in, because you go, well, I'm not going to put up that piece that's got, a kind of softer kind of edge on it. I'm going to put up the thing that's all in capital letters and really, gets people riled up and angry. And I think I don't know anybody who hasn't got a Facebook feed that's got at least one person who's really gone down that particular rabbit hole.
And that's really interesting, because, and I wish I could remember, I saw a tweet the other day where someone was saying that actually it's because of the way the media industry has changed and social media has had an impact on media and journalism, it's almost now as if the truth is hidden behind paywalls, was the kind of way they described it. And actually, I thought it was really apt because, everyone talks about the impact that people getting their news from Facebook had, but actually it put such pressure on the journalism industry that it meant that they had to find other ways to keep going. But it actually meant that a lot of the really good quality in-depth journalism is hidden away from the masses in the same way.
Completely. If you think about like a quality publication like the FT, the Financial Times, does fantastic journalism, is really well resourced. And lots of other publications, the Times, and the Irish Times in Ireland's got quite a hard paywall these days. And so actually access to really good, authoritative, quality information, in that respect, it exists. There's so much good journalism going on still. That's without a shadow of a doubt. In some ways, if you like journalism, it's almost a glory era. Like, there's fantastic features. I've recently subscribed to The Atlantic. I think it's
excellent. Yeah.
There's a lot of places doing really, really interesting, really great work. But there is a kind of imbalance there. There's a kind of, for a lot of people don't access that kind of journalism. They either can't afford to, they don't even know it's there. They don't think it's something they're going to support. They want to read. So you end up with this like kind of, some people who are hyper engaged and hyper like consumers of, and critical consumers. So I'm sure the three of us, if I see a masthead, if someone comes on to say my Twitter handle, if I see the masthead of the Financial Times, I'm much more likely to read the story, but also how I consume that story will be completely different to the masthead of a publication I've never heard of.
Yeah.
I'm unlikely to click on the masthead of the publication I've never heard of. I know from engaging with people who are acquaintances, at least, and who are on social media, who've got into conspiratorial thinking and things like that. There's almost, when I talk to them, the level of media literacy, and I don't think the answer to everything is media literacy by any stretch of the imagination, but the level of media literacy is really low. Someone will send me a headline that says, like, Bill Gates criticized by public health leaders around the world over COVID. There'll be a story with absolutely no quotes from anybody. Yeah. There will be a single person in a public health position doing that. And you kind of have to go, I will return to the person, well, that doesn't say that. But often this is the media literacy of people, it's, if you're not a consumer of news in the same way, if you're not a consumer of media, especially written media, I think we're all very visually literate, actually, because we all watch television and we all can see if a news package is badly put together and a break is wrong and the cut from one shot to the other doesn't work, because actually it draws our eyes because we're used to seeing things. We know what, like, we've watched cinemas, we've watched cinematography, we've watched, quality programming. But actually with the printed word and on the internet word, we don't actually often have the same skill set. We're not as well equipped still, ironically, I think, to parse information, to be able to see, okay, that's trustworthy information. That's the kind of information I need to find a second source on.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I even noticed more and more and more of the news outlets read it on your phone, and they've got the top 5 bullet points up at the top of the article, right? You don't even have to read the news anymore, right? You don't have to read the whole article. It's right there for you in summary form. And skimming through it isn't really going to get you anywhere. Interesting. Okay. How has the response been to the book overall, and how has that been for you?
It's, when you write a book and you put it out, there's always a part of you it's like your little baby goes out into the world and you wonder what's going to happen to this. And in this instance, the baby actually took a while longer. It was a lot longer in the oven than expected, because the book was actually due out in May. And it had to be held back because of the pandemic until early August. And I must say, I've been really, really heartened by the response to it. It's been fantastic, actually. It's been having guys like you get in touch who I hadn't known before to ask me to do appearances, which I really enjoy. But also, whether it's people in the journalism world who I know getting in touch, having read the book, whether it's lawmakers or just people I don't even know, just getting in touch, talking about it. That's been really, really heartening. A lot of people like just kind of been really kind of supportive of what I was trying to do with it, which, in some ways, having been a journalist and immersed in the story, I was both the really right person to tell it, but also at times you're never sure about just how much detail to go in. What's the thing that you want to focus in on? So, and to make sure that you've told the story in a way that's coherent, but also readable, because this information can be quite dense. So I was really trying to make sure that it felt like it had been lifted up a bit and it wasn't too tough to read. I was also helped, I think, by the timing of it, because Boris Johnson very kindly, having spent 8 months trying to suppress the Russia report, finally, was unable to stop it coming out. So that was quite good timing. The dissolution honours list from the Prime Minister as well, and which was basically just a list of cronies, is everything from his brother to Evgeny Lebedev to Tory donors. So, which I think flagged up the kind of things I'm talking about, accessing money in politics. And there has been a few funding scandals as well over the summer with the Conservative Party. So again, I think a lot of there has been a heightened awareness, I think, in Britain, or at least a conversation which hadn't been happening for a long time about the role of money in politics. So I kind of feel like it's hopefully putting a bit more ballast into that conversation that was happening already.
And what's the response been like in the UK, actually?
Well, interestingly, there has been more interest in Ireland. And I don't know why that is. Maybe, obviously, I'm Irish, but I've lived in the UK for a long time. And I write for a lot of UK publications, some of which have covered it. But it has been interesting. There's been, it was name-checked in The Economist, which is nice. It's going to be reviewed in some of the Fleet Street papers. People have been interested in it. But, I've been on BBC Northern Ireland, BBC Wales, and BBC Scotland, but not BBC Network at all. It's kind of interesting. I still feel like these are subjects that it's hard to get a hearing at times, I think, in this. I think because it's the Brexit polarization thing. So almost by the very fact that you're writing about these subjects means that you're somehow kind of on one side of a fence or another. And the book isn't like that. It's not an argument in favor of Brexit or against Brexit. So I'm nowhere near polemical enough to be brought into that sort of conversation, because I do feel like there's a real drive at Network in Britain to kind of have kind of very, very strongly oppositional voices. There's a lot of heat, but not a hell of a lot of light. And what I was trying to do with this book was the exact opposite. I'd love to reach that, get out a bit more from that, and get it a bit further than that. That's been the one thing. It is interesting, and it kind of chimes, though, if you think about how politics has worked in Britain. None of the political parties have ever shown any huge ambition to want to change this system. It's not just, the Conservatives have been in power for a long time. They're certainly in no mood to change it. It's worked for them. They've won a series of elections on the back of it. They got lots of money from private donors. This is the world they know well. But actually, Labour, when they were in power, and even when they weren't in power, have never shown any huge interest in transparency issues either. So there's a kind of plague on all your houses aspect to it, because there's, politicians I find in Britain all think they all know the system doesn't work, but they all think it can work for them. And a good example of this is actually just a very banal one about constituency spending. So Britain's got 650 constituencies. Spending is capped in each constituency. It varies slightly depending on the size, but it's between £12,000 and £15,000 in each constituency. Nobody thinks general election candidates keep within that rule. That's a tiny amount of money. It's a ridiculously small amount of money. So what they do is they funnel money through the official campaign. They get stuff done at discount rates, even when that's not supposed to happen. They basically do stuff off the books. No one is ever prosecuted, as in nobody, especially not an actual candidate. There's been about one or two instances over the years of people on election campaign staff and prosecuted, but nobody does. People in election returns that have 99.999% of spending total hit. And that's just, I think, a really just prosaic example of a kind of really broken system that everyone knows is broken. But if you're the winning candidate, are you going to want to really mess with that system? It's won you the election.
No.
Do you feel like you know how it works? You're not going to.
That kind of answers I'd written down lots of things I wanted to cover, but actually the biggest one I was going to ask was, what did you think is the biggest problem? But was it that the fact that the laws, and everyone just knows that they'll go around the laws, and because it doesn't matter, and actually the lack of power of any of the Electoral Commission or any of these things to do anything about it? Even the fact that I can't remember the exact example, but they got fined 70 grand for breaking the spending limit, but it got reduced to 4 grand. There's no accountability for anybody.
Well, the maximum fine for breaking electoral law in Britain is £20,000. That's a tiny amount of money. For £50,000 a year, the Conservative Party, you can go and have private dinners with Boris Johnson, Calvin Minutes 4 times a year. So that's
crazy.
That is the imbalance in the system. It is just the cost of doing business. And there's been, even America actually is much better than this. Michael Coleman in prison for breaking electoral law. There's lots of aspects actually of how America does transparency that actually is really good. America's got good lobbying transparency. Like, it's got a hell of a lot of lobbying, but actually, I can go and I use American disclosure documents all the time. I'm actually working on a story right today using American disclosure documents. In Britain, there's nothing like that. In Britain, it's a total free-for-all. And in many ways, it's funny, when I started doing this work, I always thought money in politics is an American thing, really. Britain, small amounts of money anyway, how bad can it be? It's not a big thing. But actually, when I wrote this book and in the investigations that led up to it, I realized that actually it's the opposite. Small amounts of money are actually far more effective in a kind of political system that relies on like small amounts of money. Because if you're going to go in there and spend £1 million in a political system that only relies on tens of millions, you can make a huge difference. It actually doesn't even need to be anywhere near £1 million. 15, 20 grand will get you a huge amount of access. Whereas America, that won't even get you to the table. And I think that actually makes places like Britain far more open to influence than you would actually imagine. Where in especially to like odd sectional interests that seem really strange. Whereas in America, you're talking about the likes of the Koch brothers, these huge billionaires, and that's where their interests get on the table. Whereas in Britain, actually, you can find really odd things appearing in the policy arena that are just like kind of pet projects of someone a corporation that's given a think tank £50,000 to write a kind of half-researched report that then gets picked up by a backbench conservative and ends up as government policy.
It's bizarre, really, like, because like I said, there's almost that playbook there from the US, and it shows how it all works. And I suppose what came across so much from the book is like that. You said you expect like it to be these big operations, like, because you think of the US with these sort of things, but actually it really came down to a small handful of people over the years peddling a particular message and just get their time just happening to come. Like, they effectively, leveraged David Cameron to put a referendum to the people that should never have happened probably in the first place. But he had these Eurosceptics in his ear over the years, and it's just all of these guys kind of doing their little chipping away in the background, and how little actually it takes in the end to make such an influence on it. It's,
I was really fascinated by that. That was what I was trying to tell at parts of the book. Like, I tell the story of the European Research Group, which is this kind of hardline group of backbench conservatives, which were all over the news for a couple of years. We're basically a party pushing for the hardest possible version of Brexit. And that had basically been a talking shop for a handful of backbench Tories over the years, until the 2016 referendum, where it then kicked into gear and was used as an already existing vehicle to push like a very, very, very extreme vision of what leaving the European Union looked like. And I think it's really striking, really interesting how these kind of small vehicles can be used by, if you have a small purposeful group of individuals with a small bit of money, they can do in many respects, incredible things.
Yeah. Oh,
absolutely.
It's crazy.
Absolutely. I think, Owen, that you and me and Peter could keep talking about this forever.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'll probably send you lots of separate questions anyway.
I think we could. This could go on for quite a while. I did an interview earlier today, Peter, where the guest said to me, Pete, you know what? We probably should have met for 10 hours before this, because we could just keep going. So I'm going to round things out a bit here. I did a little bit of my own rabbit hole investigation, which is just called looking at your website. And I came up with a couple of questions based upon my investigations. I saw that you play cricket. Have you ever watched baseball and studied the linkages between cricket and baseball?
I have watched a bit of baseball. I was, so actually quickly, as you can tell from my accent, I'm probably not from a place that play a lot of cricket. I'm from Longford town in the Midlands. And I grew up not with any cricket at all. But I did have neighbours who were English, and they used to always take out these wickets, and we'd play on the little grass outside in our estate. So I got interested in that, and I took it up in my 20s because I was a freelance journalist and I wanted to meet more people. So I took up cricket. But I always was interested in baseball too. I was a J1 student in Chicago back in almost 20 years ago. So I used to go and watch the Cubs.
Nice.
So that was really good. And then I ended up living in New York for a time, and I actually got quite into baseball. I used to go and watch I used to go. I went to Yankee Stadium once or twice, and I'm fascinated. I think they're both. It's interesting. They're two sports I think have been written about better than any other sport. There's an incredible body of literature about cricket, But also similarly, when I was actually a J1 student that time, I was reading Don DeLillo's Underworld, if anyone's read that. And it's this one of the great American novels in many respects. And the first 100 pages is about the shot that rang out across the world.
Yeah.
As a baseball fan, you know more of the specifics of that event than I can remember.
Yep.
But
Bobby.
It just feels like they're two sports that lend themselves to, because they're really individual sports masquerading as team sports. Every individual moment is one person against one person. And I think there's something fascinating about the psychology of those games, of that kind of a sport. I think there's something really, really interesting about it.
Absolutely. And they're the kind of games where you can watch for hours without actually really following what's going on with the game. And there's just so much going on out there that you wouldn't see on TV. It's just so much more interesting to watch in person. Like I said, I lived in Bermuda for a number of years and the cricket was big there, and just got kind of a small appreciation for the similarities and the overlap. Second question, and it's kind of double barreled. I saw that you did some reporting from Argentina. Does that mean you were in Argentina? Do you enjoy a steak every now and again?
Yes, I do. Yes.
What was your favorite cut of beef in Argentina?
Can I tell you my Argentina story quickly?
Do it.
I'm from my grandfather was born in Argentina, and there was a large migration from a very small part of the border between Longford and Westmeath, South Longford and kind of what would be kind of northwest Westmeath, to Argentina about 150 years ago, and it lasted for about 50 years. And when I was in secondary school, a number of my classmates had relatives from Argentina as well, had a similar story. And it's basically the Longford Irish in Argentina. Most of the immigration to Argentina came from Longford. It's very unusual. Longford is not a place. So I was very lucky. I got a grant from the Irish government as part of the centenary of the Easter Rising about the diaspora. So I went out to go and find my family story. And it was amazing to go out to Argentina and to meet people who knew where Abbey Struhl was. Abbey Struhl is a tiny village that most people in Longford don't know where it is.
Yeah.
And people were asking you about like the Rustic Inn, which is a small pub in South Longford. And it was really, really interesting. And I found the story is all up in the Irish Times. It turned out into an investigation.
Of course.
It turned into a huge investigation, and I found all these land documents from 75 years ago that at one stage looked as if I was the inheritor of about €1 million worth of farmland in the Pampas.
Whoa.
Nice.
Yeah, unfortunately, looked like.
I've got
Still there. But to answer your steak question, I had the best meal of my entire life in what's called a parrilla, which is basically like a roadside impromptu almost restaurant. They're dotted along the roads in Argentina, and it was just it was really, I'm reminiscing here, but there was everything from tomahawks to ribeyes to just everything.
Yeah.
It was just spectacular, washed down with Argentinian merlot, cooked in front of you on the grill. If you've not been, I really would recommend it.
Wow.
It's a country that does love the Irish as well.
Oh yeah,
Wonderful Irish heritage.
I love it there. For me, it was the bife de lomo at El Establo Parrilla in Buenos Aires.
Oh.
My father spent his formative years in Buenos Aires. His father worked for Gillette in South Boston and Southie, the company that makes those little things that it looks like, Peter, both you and I have struggled to find recently. And razors for those of you out there in podcast land that can't hear us. And he moved the family down to Buenos Aires from Boston to basically start up the assembly line for Gillette down in South America. And I went with my wife, my fiance at the time, about 15 years ago after we left Bermuda, and absolutely loved it. Loved it. Fantastic place.
That was my lockdown. When my mind went to somewhere in lockdown, it was Buenos Aires.
Absolutely. Owen, you got your big question, buddy?
Well, actually, so Peter, usually at the end of every show, we ask the guest, tell us something we wouldn't expect to know about you. I mean, between the cricket and the Longford Argentina story, I'm not sure there's anything else there that you have. I mean, feel free. If there's something that beats one of those two, by all means, go for it.
I'm struggling. They might be the most quality anecdotes.
They were epic by themselves.
Absolutely. I think we could call it at that.
Yeah.
Peter, this has been a delight.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thanks a million for having me, guys. I've really enjoyed the chat. It's been really fun.
That does it for this week, folks, and thanks to Peter for opening up his mind to help us figure out why he does what he does. Links and show notes for this episode are on moneyneversleeps.ie, so check us out online. Also, you could subscribe to our Money Never Sleeps newsletter at moneyneversleeps.substack.com. If you're enjoying Money Never Sleeps and want to see it continue, make sure you hop on over to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star review. Remember, if you or a colleague need help attracting and retaining great talent for your fintech or financial services company, it is highly advisable that you build a relationship with a team at Top Tier Recruitment, as they really know their stuff. You can find them at toptierrecruitment.com. And don't forget Conan Brophy from Create Sound. He mixes and edits each episode for us and is an excellent media man to get in touch with when you're thinking about launching your own podcast. As for me, I help startups get their products to market, get customers, and finance their vision. You can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or at norioventures.com. You can follow Owen Fitzgerald on Twitter at OwenFitzgerald9. Finally, till next time, thanks for listening. See ya!
Money never sleeps, pal.